if you have not heard, Xander Schauffele was caught with a non-conforming driver, and it was kind of the talk of last week. And Tony has done a lot of research on this, talked to a lot of people about it, and we've learned a lot of information about it. And I think our purpose of talking about this today is to tell people like, how big of a deal is this? What does it mean? And who's to blame, right? So there were 3 companies, from what I heard, that had illegal drivers that got caught. Out of the 30 players tested, there was 1 Callaway that we know of, I think 1 Ping and 1 TaylorMade. And that was confirmed by Golf Digest. And what does, Tony, can you kind of tell people, how big of a deal is this? Where did this stem from? Just start back from where we were talking about this years ago,
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to understand, right, there are rules that govern how fast the face of a driver can be, and not to at the risk of, or to avoid getting too technical, like, just bottom line is it's 239 microseconds, right? That is the limit, and I think that's where the conversation needs to start, because sort of since that limit was put into place, some things have evolved. Manufacturing has evolved. Lots of things have changed that are allowing manufacturers to stretch that limit into the USGA and R&A's tolerance zone. So the limit is 239. Let's be really, really clear about that.
Tell people what that limit means.
R&D.
Explain what that limit means. 239 is a number, but what does that mean to the average golfer?
So it's a number. It's a value in microseconds. It's basically, to CT test a driver, it gets locked into this pendulum apparatus. So they kind of swing a pendulum into the driver face and measure how long that pendulum stays in contact with the face, right? Because as the driver is kind of flexing, as it flexes away, the pendulum stays in contact, and then when it flexes out, it kicks the pendulum off, I guess is a quick way to visualize that. And so 239 microseconds, that's how long the pendulum is allowed to stay in contact with the driver face. But because everything has tolerances, right? Head manufacturing has a tolerance. The CT machines have a tolerance. The guy doing the measurement, you're going to get different measurements depending on who's doing those measurements. Everything has a tolerance. And so the USGA gives you 18 microseconds of wiggle room that gets us to 257 as your sort of extended limit. But again, the limit is 239. And if everybody designed to 239 tried to keep their drivers close to 239, none of this would have happened. We wouldn't be having this conversation. But because manufacturers are trying to take advantage of that 18 microseconds of wiggle room and push things towards the extended end of the limit, that 257, you get into situations where drivers are showing up non-conforming by accident because of tolerances, because of all that. In addition to the stuff we've heard that, going back a couple of years, was probably intentionally non-conforming on tour.
So what was
a couple
Sanders
of different
at?
things in play, to say the least.
Sanders there's 1 point over.
He was at 258?
Yeah, so
You're joking.
the short answer is yes. As I've heard it, he was well within the limit on Callaway's CT machine. The R&A's machine disagreed. They did some stuff to retest. The R&A's machine still disagreed. And so the driver
it disagreed
non-conforming, and
it disagreed higher though, right?
Yeah, that's
so
what I've heard.
The Callaway took off weights, put lighter weights on it, gave it back to them, and it went up. So who's the blame here? Is it the R&A, or is everyone's different? Everyone has a different machine, and therefore tolerances are
I can
different.
tell you who it's not. It's not the players, and here's why. In my opinion, and if anybody else has an opinion, obviously speak up, because I'm really interested to hear what y'all think on this. But take baseball, right? A guy doesn't take steroids in baseball to hit it 1 foot further. Okay, you take steroids in baseball to go from a guy that hits 0 home runs to hitting 50 home runs, like Brett Boone. You know what I mean? Or what was the guy's name for the Orioles that literally hit like 50 home runs 3 years in a row? You know what I mean? Or Barry Bonds' head going from size 7 1/4 to 10 and having braces. That's what
Xander's head seems to be normal sized.
Yeah. So just think, you take that for a major advantage. The risk for a professional to do something non-conforming, illegal, whatever it is, steroids, non-conforming drivers, is such a risky thing. You've worked your whole life for this, right? If it's going to make you be a pro, and you almost guarantees that by taking steroids or whatever, that's risk reward, right?
sure.
And you're going, that's worth the risk.
Yeah. And
Tony, tell people what the difference is between a 257 driver and a 258 driver, which was what Xander drivers. What does that mean in driver distance?
Inches.
Inches. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, the rule of thumb is every 10 CT points is worth about a half a mile of ball speed. So if you can go from 239 to 257, you're going to be pushing 1 mile an hour ball speed, and that's something guys would appreciate, guys would want to benefit from. If you're going to intentionally cheat going from 239 to 270, something like that, which would certainly be possible, that's going to get you some real distance. Going from 257 to 258, nobody is going to go out there and actively risk their reputation for
And
nothing.
I agree.
Absolutely
I
nothing.
think it's the RNA's fault, to be honest with you. I think their measuring device, they should have 3. If it fails one, you measure it again, you measure it again.
But the RNA, they're still stuck in
Well-
old-fashioned times. They might have an old-fashioned CT machine.
Well,
But
but again, we've said this, right? Like I said that there are tolerances built into this. So if the USGA and the RNA says the limit is 239, which they're very clear about, and say, hey, we're going to give you a little bit of extra space because of all these things that can vary with manufacturing and measurements, and you come in with a driver that's close to the limit, and you intentionally, and when I say the limit, I mean that 257 number, when you're intentionally bumping as close to that limit as you can possibly get, knowing that tolerances are built into every aspect of this, you can't really blame the RNA when you exceed those tolerances.
Right.
Like
And
if that driver was plus or minus 239 or 242 or even 245, which is the upper limit of what anybody is truly designing for, if you're at 239 to 245, there's nothing that's going to happen in those tolerances that pushes a driver beyond the.
But let me ask you a question.
So,
If I tell you, Tony, you can go to 257, right, as the RNA or whoever, why would the manufacturers and the golfers not try to push that to the limit?
I think that they
well,
would
no,
be.
you,
Like,
you
have to-
absolutely do, but you in doing so, you need to remain cognizant of the fact that that limit is what it is because of the manufacturing tolerances and because of the measuring tolerances and all these. So you
agree
can't
with
push
Tony.
to 255, 254, whatever Xander's was on the Callaway machine, maybe even a little bit less. You can't push it to that number and then go and then complain because you got busted
Then
by
don't have a
the
test if
tolerances
you don't
for
have
you
machines.
existing.
Then don't have a test if you don't have machines that are consistent enough to know what the hell you're playing.
Well, then,
I think it's.
But again, they're saying if that's at 239, it's under the limit on every machine. And so, when you get up 250, the mid 250s, that's when you're really dancing on the line and playing with fire. And everybody who does that knows they're doing it. So you can't be like, hey, we're going to come in the low to mid 250s and then bitch when we get hit with tolerances.
right,
Even if there is a problem with the RNA's machine with a little bit too much wiggle room, if you're closer to where you're supposed to be, it's a non-issue.
To put somebody out there publicly as a cheater, it's just there's too many unknowns in this, how it's tested, why it's tested like this, and the machinery to be doing this the way it is right now.
I think it's really Callaway and the RNA. Callaway probably shouldn't be pulling drivers that are that close to the tolerance limit. The RNA has a responsibility.
But the only thing,
hang on, the RNA has a responsibility to make sure that everybody who participates in this test has, is the RNA saying, hey, we want to make sure you have the right CT tester to make sure that you're not exceeding our limits.
Let me ask you a question based on that. Do you think anyone involved in this knew that was an illegal driver?
No.
Correct. So
But
if you didn't purposely do it and didn't even know it, then no one, how can we fix that problem to where that people know definitively if they're cheating or not?
At the end of the day,
Well,
the rules
that's
are the
the thing,
rules,
though.
and the
So
RNA can't
keep
just
in mind,
let.
Hold
Sorry,
on.
go ahead.
There's no penalty. There's no penalty here, right? So and it's kind of, nobody's ever said, hey, this is why we do it to the best of my knowledge. But if you look, like Xander's driver was tested on Tuesday before the Open. So the entire approach isn't to sort of bust people and label them as cheaters. It's to prevent non-conforming clubs from ever making it into tournament play.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was reading a story this morning, and they were saying that, Xander originally thought that the USGA called him out, and who knows what the reality is and what actually happened. But now they're thinking that just people in the van that were part of seeing what was being measured might have leaked the information out, or just not leaked it out on purpose, but just talked about it, right?
Yeah,
but
I think
that's
it was
a bad
handled a
look.
little unprofessionally by the RNA to let that go, especially as Xander's the only one that we know of whose driver was.
Well, he was the only one
announced as-
named.
Right, he was
He was the only one named. And
right.
we talked about this before the show. I've been told by highly, highly credible sources that, while Xander is being labeled as the first guy to fail a CT test, more accurately, he's the first guy to be publicly named for failing a CT test. As I understand it, there were a handful of drivers on the PGA Tour last year that came back non-conforming. And so, they make adjustments. Again, the idea is to prevent these things from getting into competition, not to make a big deal out of guys using non-conforming clubs in competition.
Well,
so
here's the thing: is if they're pushing the limit constantly, after you've hit, say, 200 driver shots, which is easily done for those pros, the limit's going to change again, and it's probably going to get even more.
Well, drivers, break in a couple
Exactly.
CT points. So there's all these different things that change. But if the machinery was consistent and you know that, right, you would just measure it before each tournament and you know where you're at,
Yeah.
And
That's
said,
true.
don't push it to 257 every week.
That's a really good point. But then, so Shafferty said he was talking about, well, if you're going to test a few, why don't you test the whole field? Well, for me, it's a random drug test. You get randomly selected. It's a random thing. Because if you did that, we wouldn't even see any golf because it's so many
Yeah, they'd
people.
be getting their drivers tested.
There's
the
no
whole week.
need to test
Exactly.
everybody. You agree, Tony?
It's not point.
So-
There's no point.
typical field, 150 golfers, right? Plus or minus. Takes
10%.
10 minutes to test the driver, and that's if you're that's your cursory, hey, we're just going to do the basic test. But if it's close, then you've got to retest it and kind of go through all those motions. That can bring that test time up to 20 plus minutes. So, I mean, think about that. Even if everybody goes through in 10 minutes, 150 times 10 minutes. No, it's not practical.
It's 150
What these guys
minutes.
supposed to wait in line with their drivers outside the trailer? You're taking the clubs out of their hand at a time they're supposed to be using them.
And then you would say basically, all right, we'll get more people doing the CT testing, but then you've added a variable in there. So
let me
it's
bring
not
this
practical.
back full circle a little bit if I can try. And that is, okay, this now has happened. It's out in the public domain, right? Pandora's box is kind of open. What do we think is going to happen from here? Because if they keep testing like they are, it's going to keep happening. So what do we think needs to happen? Change or whatever in regards to making this a not shit show of what it was last week,
I think nothing's probably going to happen because that's typically what happens with the USGA and RNA. The preference, right, is to keep everything quiet and not leak out test results. And as long as they're able to do that, then in theory, the current system works, even if it doesn't. My feeling is that maybe this should be let's see what's being used in tournaments, right? Because if you test a driver on Tuesday and a guy wants to cheat, there's nothing that prevents him from getting a different head for the weekend, you know?
Well,
So my feeling is at least the top 10 guys, right? The guys who look like they're going to finish in the top 10, test those drivers as they come off the course, right? You have to keep it limited because you don't want to be on a Sunday afternoon and telling everybody, hey, you got to hang out here at wherever the tournament is. Don't catch your flight. Just chill here until we test all the drivers. But certainly I think top 10 should be tested and then a random sampling from,
that's
from
a tough
anybody
one,
who makes the cut. Because if you don't make the cut, you're not getting paid.
Well, DeChambeau had an idea
not to
today.
say who cares if you cheated, but there's no impact. So let's really see what's making it into competition, not what's being used on Tuesday. And I would suspect that in the overwhelming majority of cases, those are the same things, but there's no guarantee. So let's look at what's coming off the course on a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, DeChambeau said we should test one driver basically, and that's whoever wins, we test your driver. And if I don't like this idea because
like the NASCAR.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's say you win the tournament and your driver's illegal, and then you gotta dude, that's a media nightmare.
Yeah,
and
and then
pick a
so
different winner.
I mean, it's top 10. If you think about that, look at the domino effect. If say number one wins, all right, then you drop out and you don't get paid that week. So then someone else bumps up, and then it's just like, oh, well, I'm a reject. I came second, but hey, I won. That's great news.
And once again, you're blaming it on the player at that point. You're going, the player takes all the heat for that, right? He plays in this tournament, wins.
Yeah.
You go over one CT point, and he didn't even know it. Is that his fault?
Yeah,
that
I think
one-
at the end of
yeah.
the day, it's both the RNA and the manufacturers have to step up and say, all right, let's pay a little bit more attention to what we're giving our tour pros because they're the face of our brands. Do you think Callaway is happy that Xander Schauffele's name got thrown out there like that?
I don't think there's anybody happy in this situation.
Right. So I mean, Callaway's got to look back and say, all right, let's double check. Let's double check our processes. Let's work with the RNA to make sure that we're using the same testing protocols to make sure that we're giving stuff that's legal to everybody.
Well, back in the day, it used to be completely different, right? They used to go into the tour van and say, all right, we're here to CT test, and then you pull out the secret drawer, and then here's all the conforming heads, and that's his driver, that's his driver.
Well,
it's came.
There's been rumors of that, but whether that's true or not doesn't matter anymore because that doesn't work either as a solution, you know?
But exactly, that's why they changed it to do random.
Well, yes, that and there were, I think a couple brands in their ear saying, hey, we've got it on pretty good authority that there are non-conforming clubs in play with intent, like knowingly non-conforming clubs in play. And
That's a good point, Tony.
But it's funny, right? The entire conversation around non-conformance is we're talking about just driver CT, but the reality is if you're going to go after driver CT, right, if that's what you're going to test, are you also going to test wedge and iron grooves, right? Because there are rules that dictate conformance there. You're going to test the golf balls when they walk off the course.
Yeah,
like,
where'd you go? Where'd you stop?
It's
Sorry.
such a can of worms here.
It is.
It's really difficult. And as far as the simple solution, and nobody likes this solution, but the real and actual solution is for manufacturers to design to the actual limit, the 239 number, and try and keep it close to 239 and not push the boundaries. Because again, tolerance exists for a reason, and this is just Callaway and unfortunately Xander Schauffele ending up on the wrong side of those reasons. But if Callaway was putting a driver that was designed to be 239 and was really close to 239 in their tour players' hands,
You never have an issue.
None of this conversation happens.
Well, I still love Xander. He's
At
got
the
a
end,
great swing.
at the end of the day, it's not the player's fault.